The 38-year-old cook had spent 6 months working in the home of industrialist Harrison Caldwell in Charleston, South Carolina, while secretly searching for answers regarding the mysterious disappearance of her mother Stella, who had abandoned her at the age of 15, leaving behind only an enigmatic letter about protecting the truth. What Dana found that Thursday afternoon, when Harrison returned home early and discovered her holding the antique documents, would expose a conspiracy of fraud, blackmail and cowardice stretching back years, involving powerful men willing to ruin lives to guard their secrets. When Dana Miller discovered the truth hidden in her boss's locked office, she never imagined that moment would not only change her life, but unearth 2 decades of secrets that had destroyed her family. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. The discovery that her mother was still alive, hidden in another city, living under a new name, paralyzed by the fear of a man who vowed to destroy her if she ever spoke. This is the true story of how a determined daughter confronted the past, saved a man from his own mistakes, and alongside her mother, finally faced the cruel manipulator who had stolen decades of their lives. Stay tuned to discover how this battle for justice ended and the shocking fate of the man who thought he was above consequence. The headache hammered against Harrison Caldwell's temples with an intensity he could no longer ignore. Seated at his desk in the office of the high-end kitchenware manufacturing firm he had built over 3 decades in Charleston, the 52-year-old businessman massaged his forehead with tired fingers, trying to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong that day. The clock ticked past 3 in the afternoon when he finally gave up trying to work, tucked a few papers into a drawer, and notified his secretary that he was heading home early. It wasn't his habit to leave before quitting time, but the pressure behind his eyes made concentration impossible. Harrison grabbed his car keys and drove through the cobblestone streets of historic downtown Charleston, distantly observing the colonial architecture that gave the southern city its characteristic charm, unaware that this seemingly simple decision would completely change the course of his life. As he parked in front of the 2-story colonial revival mansion, where he had lived alone since his divorce 5 years prior, Harrison noted that the afternoon was strangely quiet. He opened the main door and was greeted by a sonic emptiness that immediately felt wrong. Usually, at this hour, he could hear sounds drifting from the kitchen, where Dana Miller, his 38-year-old cook, would be preparing dinner while listening to the radio at a low volume. The aroma of spices and food on the stove always filled the house around 3:30, but today there was nothing. Only silence. Harrison dropped his briefcase on the hall table and walked toward the kitchen, expecting to find a note explaining Dana's absence. But everything was in order, clean and organized, with no sign that she had left or fallen ill. It was then that he heard it. A subtle, almost imperceptible noise coming from the 2nd floor. A light dragging sound, as if someone was moving something carefully to avoid making noise. Harrison's heart sped up. He ascended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under his weight, while the headache pulsed even harder. Reaching the 2nd-floor corridor, he came upon something that made him stop dead, the blood freezing in his veins. The door to his private study, the room he always kept under strict lock and key, was ajar. The dark wood stood out against the light wall, and a sliver of light escaped through the opening. Harrison felt his mouth go dry. He was absolutely certain he had locked that door this morning, as he did every day for years. With his heart pounding, Harrison pushed the door open slowly, and what he saw on the other side stole the air from his lungs. Dana was there, crouched beside his personal safe, built into the wall behind a built-in bookcase, and in her hands were various yellow documents and antique photographs. Time-worn papers, faded photos, bank receipts, all scattered across the wooden floor around her. The woman, her brown hair pulled back in a messy bun and her hands visibly trembling, looked up when she realized his presence. Tears were streaming down her face, leaving shiny tracks on her cheeks. Harrison opened his mouth to demand an explanation, to yell, to do anything, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, watching this scene that defied all logic. Dana wiped her face with the back of her hand, but the tears kept falling. She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage, and then said, in a low, choked voice, something Harrison could never have imagined hearing. She said she was Stella Field's daughter. The name echoed in the silent office like distant thunder, bringing with it memories that Harrison had tried to bury for more than 2 decades. Stella Fields, his first secretary, the woman who had worked alongside him during the company's earliest, most difficult years, when everything was uncertain and every decision seemed to determine whether the factory would survive or not. Stella, who one day simply vanished, leaving only silence and unanswered questions. Dana rose from the floor, holding an old photograph between her fingers. In the faded image, Harrison recognized himself, much younger, next to Stella and his former business partner, Owen Barrett, all smiling in front of the newly painted factory facade. It was from Inauguration Day, 23 years ago. Dana's voice trembled as she explained that she grew up hearing fragmented stories about her mother, a woman who had been forced to abandon everything and disappear without a trace. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, Dana lived with her maternal grandmother in a small house outside Charleston, always feeling the weight of an absence that was never properly explained. At 15, she found a letter her mother had left before leaving, an enigmatic message full of apologies and vague mentions of protecting the truth and making necessary sacrifices. Harrison felt his legs weaken and had to lean against the doorframe. The revelation hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. Dana continued speaking, recounting how she spent years trying to understand what had happened, asking the few acquaintances her grandmother had, but no one knew or wanted to talk about Stella's disappearance. When she turned 18 and her grandmother passed away, Dana was left alone with her questions and a growing determination to uncover the truth. She cherished her mother's letter as her most prized possession, reading and rereading the words until she had memorized them, searching for hidden clues between the lines. That was how, 6 months ago, she decided to act. She secured a forged recommendation through an old family acquaintance and applied for the cook position at Harrison's house, knowing exactly who he was. For the past 6 months, Dana had lived a double life within that mansion. By day, she prepared meals, cleaned, organized, perfectly fulfilling her duties as a cook. Harrison always treated her with professional distance, as he did all his staff, never imagining that behind those intense brown eyes was a determined investigator. At night, when Harrison retired to his room or left for business dinners, Dana discreetly searched the house, looking for anything that might explain what had happened to Stella. She examined every room, every drawer, every shelf, always careful to leave everything exactly as it was. But the study had remained inaccessible, protected by that lock Dana couldn't pick, until this morning. When Harrison rushed out to work, he forgot the key in the lock. It was an unprecedented oversight, something that had never happened before, and Dana interpreted it as a sign. As soon as she heard his car drive away, she went upstairs, turned the key, and entered the forbidden office. What she found surpassed her most ambitious expectations. The safe was hidden behind a movable bookcase, and to her surprise, it wasn't locked. Inside, there were organized folders with documents dating back to the company's early years, old photographs, bank receipts, contracts, and among it all, papers that mentioned her mother's name repeatedly. Harrison finally recovered his voice. He asked in a rough whisper how she had gotten in. Dana answered without hesitation, with no apparent guilt in her voice, that he had forgotten the key this morning. Then, turning completely to face him, she asked the question she had been rehearsing for months, the question that had consumed her since she was a teenager. She wanted to know what he had done to her mother. She wanted to know why Stella had to disappear. She wanted to know what truth was so dangerous that it justified abandoning a 15-year-old daughter. The intensity in her eyes made Harrison take a step back, and in that moment, he realized there was no escape. He would have to confront a past he had tried to forget for over 2 decades. Harrison walked slowly to his leather armchair and sank heavily into it, feeling the weight of all those years of silence pressing down on his shoulders. He looked at Dana, at this woman who had worked in his home for 6 months without him ever suspecting her true intentions, and saw in her Stella's unmistakable features. The same intense brown eyes, the same determination in the line of her jaw, the same upright posture, even in the face of adversity. How had he not noticed before? Perhaps because he never truly looked at her, he thought bitterly. Perhaps because he always avoided truly looking at the people around him, afraid they might see through him, too. With a tired voice, Harrison began to speak. He recounted that Stella was hired in the first few months of the factory's operation, back when he and Owen Barrett still co-managed the company as partners. She was competent, dedicated, discreet, qualities Harrison valued immensely. For 5 years, Stella handled all the administrative aspects of the business, organizing documents, controlling expenses, and keeping the financial records straight. Harrison trusted her completely, just as he trusted Owen, his partner and friend since college. But that trust, Harrison explained with a bitter tone, proved to be a terrible mistake. Dana remained standing, motionless, absorbing every word. Harrison continued, explaining that Stella began noticing inconsistencies in the financial records, figures that didn't match up, unexplained expenses, transfers that didn't correspond to any known company activity. She was too meticulous to ignore it, so she started investigating on her own, slowly assembling a worrying picture. Owen Barrett was systematically embezzling money from the firm. These weren't small amounts, but significant sums he used to finance a lifestyle far exceeding what his partner's salary would allow. Imported cars, expensive dinners, international travel, all paid for with money that should have been in the company's coffers. When Stella confronted Harrison with the evidence she had gathered, he felt the floor drop out from under him. Owen wasn't just his business partner, he was his best friend, the man who had stood by him when he risked everything to open the firm. The idea that this same man could be stealing from the company seemed impossible. Absurd. Harrison wanted to believe there was some mistake, some reasonable explanation for the inconsistencies. He asked for time to investigate personally, promising Stella he would handle the matter carefully. But before he could do anything, Owen discovered he was being investigated. What happened next still haunted Harrison on sleepless nights. Owen didn't deny the accusations when confronted, but he showed no remorse either. Instead, he revealed that he possessed information about Stella's past, information that could completely destroy her reputation and cause serious problems for her family. Harrison never knew exactly what those secrets were, but he saw the terror in Stella's eyes when Owen threatened her. His partner gave her 2 options: leave the city in silence or watch her life publicly collapse. And then, looking directly at Harrison, Owen made it clear that any attempt to report him would drag the entire company into the scandal, destroying everything they had built. Harrison closed his eyes, his voice dropping even lower as he admitted the part that shamed him the most. He didn't defend Stella, he didn't confront Owen, he didn't report the embezzlement. Instead, he chose the path of cowardice, convincing himself he was protecting the company, the employees' jobs, his own future. He allowed Owen to fire Stella, allowed the threats to force her to leave Charleston, allowed it all to happen while he stood by silently, watching. Stella left on a Monday morning without saying goodbye, without leaving an address, simply disappearing as if she had never existed. And Harrison, cowardly, pretended it didn't affect him, that she was just another employee who had quit. Dana listened to everything with clenched fists, her nails digging into her palms. Silent tears continued to stream down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. When Harrison finished speaking, the silence that fell upon the study was dense, heavy as lead. Dana finally moved, picking up some of the papers scattered on the floor. They were bank receipts, Harrison realized, dated from different periods over the last 20 years. She held them up toward him, her voice charged with an emotion that wavered between anger and confusion, as she asked what these documents were, why he had been sending money to an account in Asheville, North Carolina, every month for so long. Harrison felt a blush creep up his neck. Those receipts were his pathetic attempt to ease his conscience, a way to compensate for his omission without actually having to face the consequences of his actions. 2 months after Stella left Charleston, he managed to find out she had settled in Asheville, a mountain town a few hours away. Through a discreet contact, he set up monthly transfers to an account in her name, amounts that gradually increased over the years. He never tried to contact her directly, never apologized, never explained. He just sent the money religiously, as if that could somehow balance the moral scale of his cowardice. Dana let the papers drop back to the floor, and her voice was sharp as she said that money didn't replace a mother, it didn't replace truth, it didn't replace dignity. Harrison had no answer for that. He knew she was right. For over 2 decades, he had lived with the weight of that decision, carrying the guilt in silence, avoiding thinking too deeply about Stella and what she had faced after leaving everything behind. He built a seemingly successful life, expanded the factory, accumulated wealth, but he could never shake the feeling that there was rottenness in its foundations. After Owen sold his share of the company and moved to New York 15 years ago, Harrison thought he could finally move on, but the monthly receipts kept being sent, constant reminders of his weakness. Dana walked to the study window, observing the streets of Charleston below, where everyday life followed its normal rhythm, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding in that room. She asked, without turning around, if Harrison knew where her mother was now, if she still lived in Asheville, if she was okay, if she had rebuilt her life. Harrison admitted he knew nothing. The transfers were automatic, but he never checked if the money was being withdrawn, never tried to confirm if Stella was still there. It was easier not to know, he explained with brutal honesty, easier to simply keep sending the money and pretend that was enough. Harrison's cell phone rang, breaking the tense moment. He looked at the screen and saw it was the factory, probably his secretary wanting to confirm something. He ignored the call. None of that seemed important now, given the magnitude of what was happening in his study. Dana turned around, and there was something different in her eyes now, a cold determination replacing the tears. She said she was going to Asheville to look for her mother, that she needed to hear from Stella herself what truly happened, needed to understand the whole story. Harrison started to say something about waiting, about thinking it over, but she cut him off with a firm gesture of her hand. Dana informed him that she wasn't asking for permission or advice. She was merely notifying him that she was leaving for a few days, that she might not return to work there after everything she had discovered. She began gathering the documents from the floor, putting them back into the safe with mechanical movements. Harrison watched, unsure what to say, unsure how to fix it, unsure if there was any way to mend something that had been broken for so long. When Dana finished tidying the papers and headed for the door, she stopped at the frame and looked back one last time. Her voice was calmer now, but it carried an immense weight, as she said she had spent 6 months working in that house, preparing food for him, cleaning, taking care of everything, while the man who helped destroy her mother's life didn't even know who she really was. Harrison remained seated in his armchair long after Dana descended the stairs and left the house, hearing the sound of the front door closing echo through the empty mansion. The headache that had brought him home early no longer mattered, superseded by a much deeper pain pulsing in his chest. He looked around his study, the space he had always considered his private sanctuary, And for the first time in years, he truly saw what was there. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a tomb, a place where he buried his mistakes and his cowardice, locking them behind closed doors and pretending they didn't exist. He rose slowly and walked to the still open safe. He picked up one of the old photographs Dana had left on the shelf, the one from the factory inauguration. He observed the smiling faces of three people who had no idea how their lives would intertwine in such painful ways. Stella looked at the camera with hope in her eyes, hope he had helped destroy. Owen smiled confidently, already hiding the greed that would eventually lead him to betray everyone around him. And he himself, Harrison, so young and full of ambition, never imagining that one day he would have to look at that photograph and recognize the weak man he had become. The phone rang again, and this time Harrison answered. It was his secretary, informing him there was an urgent message from an important client. He said he would handle it in the morning, that he wasn't feeling well. He hung up without hearing the reply and stood there in the middle of his study, feeling for the first time in decades the full weight of his choices. Dana was right. Money didn't compensate for anything. Bank transfers didn't erase cowardice. Silence didn't protect anyone. It only perpetuated the pain. And now, with Stella's daughter knowing everything, with the secrets finally exposed to the light, Harrison realized he would have to make a choice very different from the one he made 23 years ago. He would have to decide whether he would finally find the courage to face his past or continue being the man who chose the easy path, regardless of the cost to others. The afternoon was fading over Charleston, staining the sky with orange hues that streamed through the study windows. Harrison put the photograph back in the safe and, for the first time in many years, left the door open. There was no point in locking away secrets that had already been revealed. He walked down the stairs slowly, each step feeling like it weighed a ton, and reaching the empty kitchen, where Dana should have been preparing dinner, he felt her absence as a physical void in the room. He wondered if she would return, if there was any chance of redeeming himself in her eyes and Stella's, or if he had crossed a line that allowed no return. And for the first time in a long time, Harrison Caldwell had no answers, only the echo of his own failures reverberating through the empty walls of his house. Dana drove along the winding roads connecting Charleston to Asheville, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers ached. The drive of just over 3 hours seemed to stretch infinitely, every mile heavy with the weight of that afternoon's revelations. The sun had completely set when she finally spotted the first lights of the mountain town, known for its scenic views and architecture that blended the old and the modern. Dana had never been there before, despite knowing for years that her mother was possibly in that city. Throughout her adult life, she kept the address she found in her grandmother's old planner, but she was always afraid to make the trip, afraid of what she might discover, afraid of being rejected again. Now, however, fear had been replaced by a burning urgency. After confronting Harrison and hearing his pathetic confession, Dana needed to hear her mother's version, needed to understand why a woman would abandon her teenage daughter, what threats were terrible enough to justify such a sacrifice. She parked the car on a street near the city center and pulled the crumpled paper from her purse, where she had written down Stella's last known address. It was a quiet, tree-lined street with modest but well-maintained homes. Number 247 corresponded to a simple white house with light blue trim, featuring a small front porch where pots of ferns hung. Dana stood on the sidewalk for long minutes, observing the house illuminated through the living room window curtains. She could see shadows moving inside, indicating someone was home. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears, drowning out all other sounds of the night. She took several deep breaths, trying to gather her courage, and finally walked up to the door. Before she could change her mind, she rang the doorbell. The seconds that followed seemed to drag on forever. Dana heard footsteps approaching from the other side of the door. the sound of a lock being opened, and then the door opened, revealing a woman of about 60. Greying hair pulled back in a low ponytail, wearing reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. The woman looked at Dana with a politely curious expression, waiting for the visitor to introduce herself. But Dana was paralyzed, because even with the changes brought by 23 years, even with the grey hair and the wrinkles around her eyes, she instantly recognized that face. It was her mother. It was Stella. The old photographs Dana kept did no justice to the reality of having that woman standing there, inches away, alive, real, breathing. Stella also seemed confused by the visitor's reaction, slightly furrowing her brow, when suddenly her expression changed completely. Her eyes widened, her hand flew to cover her mouth, and she whispered a name she hadn't spoken in over 2 decades. Dana. Mother and daughter stood frozen in the doorway, staring at each other as if they were seeing ghosts. Stella took a step back, swaying slightly, and had to lean on the doorframe to steady herself. Dana felt the tears she had been holding back during the entire drive finally escape, streaming hot down her face. She tried to say something, anything, but her voice failed. Stella extended a trembling hand toward her daughter, as if wanting to touch her to confirm she was real, but then withdrew it, uncertain. The tension between them was almost palpable, laden with years of absence, hurt, and unanswered questions. Finally, it was Stella who broke the silence, inviting Dana inside in a voice so low it was barely audible. The interior of the house was simple but welcoming, decorated with modest furniture and plants in various corners. Dana followed her mother into the living room, where Stella nervously gestured toward the sofa. They sat down, maintaining a respectful distance, still processing the shock of the unexpected reunion. Stella removed her reading glasses and placed them on the coffee table with visibly trembling hands. Dana noticed an open book there, marking that her mother had been reading when the doorbell rang. Mundane details that seemed absurdly normal, given the magnitude of the moment. Stella started to speak, but her voice failed on the first attempt. She cleared her throat, tried again, and asked how Dana had found her. Dana told her about the address in her grandmother's planner, about the years of keeping that information without the courage to use it, about the anger and resentment that had grown over time. Stella listened with silent tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. When Dana mentioned that she had worked as a cook in Harrison Caldwell's house for the past 6 months, Stella was visibly shocked. Her mouth formed a silent O of surprise and horror, and she asked in a raspy voice if Harrison knew who Dana really was. Dana confirmed that he did, that he had discovered it that very afternoon when he found her in his study, searching through his secrets. Stella's expression cycled through several emotions in quick succession: shock, fear, worry, and finally, a tired resignation. She got up from the sofa and walked to the window, observing the dark street outside, with her arms crossed over her chest, as if protecting herself. Dana remained seated, waiting, knowing she needed to give her mother time to process everything. Finally, Stella spoke again, her voice carrying the deep exhaustion of someone who had carried a heavy burden for too long. She said she never wanted to abandon Dana, that the decision to leave was the hardest she had ever made in her life. But at the time, it seemed like the only way to protect her daughter. Stella began recounting her version of the events Harrison had described a few hours earlier. She confirmed she had discovered Owen Barrett's fraud, confirmed she had been threatened and forced to leave Charleston. But there were details Harrison didn't know, parts of the story only Stella understood. Owen didn't just threaten her with information about her past. He explicitly stated that if she didn't disappear and keep silent, he would make sure Dana also suffered the consequences. At the time, Dana was 15, a vulnerable teenager who depended completely on her mother. Owen knew exactly where to strike to guarantee Stella's cooperation. And then he did something even crueler. He said that if Stella ever attempted to contact her daughter, if she sent letters, if she made calls, he would know and consider it a breach of the silence agreement. Dana felt nausea rise in her throat hearing this. All the anger she felt toward her mother began to transform into something more complex, a mixture of compassion, horror, and fury directed at Owen Barrett. Stella continued, explaining that she spent the first few years in Asheville living in constant fear, expecting Owen to show up at any moment to fulfill his threats. She changed her name, becoming Elaine Rhodes, secured a humble job as an administrative assistant at a small local artisans cooperative, and gradually built a new life based on lies and omissions. She never told anyone about her former life in Charleston, never mentioned she had a daughter, never allowed anyone to get close enough to ask questions. The money Harrison sent monthly began appearing in her account 2 months after her arrival in Asheville. Stella admitted that she initially thought about refusing, about returning the transfers, but the financial reality was too harsh. On the minimum wage she earned, she barely managed to pay rent and food. Harrison's money, though representing his guilt and cowardice, was also a practical lifeline, so she accepted it, hating herself for it, but using it to survive and eventually to do something she considered important. Stella walked to a small office beside the living room and returned carrying an old shoebox. She placed it on the coffee table and opened it, revealing stacks of envelopes organized by date. Dana looked at the contents of the box without understanding. Stella explained that each envelope contained a letter she had written to her daughter over the years, all unsent, all kept there as a testament to a love that could never be expressed. In the first years after leaving Charleston, Stella wrote almost daily, pouring onto paper all the emotions she couldn't share. Over time, the letters became less frequent, weekly, then monthly, but they never stopped completely. Dana picked up one of the envelopes with trembling hands and opened it. Her mother's handwriting was familiar from the only letter she had ever received, that enigmatic message left before her departure. This one, however, was different. Dated a few months after the disappearance, the letter contained desperate apologies, explanations about the fear that consumed her, promises that one day they would reunite. Tears fell onto the yellowed paper as Dana read, slightly blurring the ink. She picked up another envelope and another, reading fragments of a life lived in secret, of a maternal love that never died despite the forced distance. Stella sat beside her daughter on the sofa, closer now, and hesitantly placed a hand on Dana's shoulder. The touch was like a dam breaking. Dana turned and hugged her mother for the first time in 23 years, and both women wept, releasing decades of pain, longing, and regret. They stayed that way for long minutes, wrapped in the sound of their own sobs, healing wounds that seemed too old to be mendable. When they finally separated, Stella went to the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of water. They sat down again, this time side by side, and continued talking. Dana told her about her life, about the difficult years living with her grandmother, who also suffered from her daughter's absence, but never fully explained what had happened. She spoke about the loneliness of growing up without a mother, about how she developed a tough shell around her heart to protect herself from the pain. Stella listened with an expression of agony, every word from her daughter like a stab, reminding her of the price her choice had cost. She asked about the grandmother, and Dana had to deliver the difficult news that she had passed away 5 years ago, taking her own secrets and sorrows with her. Stella closed her eyes upon hearing the news, more tears escaping through her tightly shut eyelids. Her mother, the woman who raised Dana in her absence, was gone without them being able to reconcile. Another loss, another regret, to add to the collection. Dana noticed how guilt weighed on her mother's shoulders, making her seem smaller, more fragile. But there was also strength there, she realized. Strength to have survived all those years alone. Strength to have rebuilt a life from scratch. Strength to have kept those letters as a promise of a love that would never be forgotten. The anger Dana had felt for so many years began to dissolve, replaced by a deeper, more complex understanding of the impossible choices her mother had to make. The conversation stretched late into the night. Stella brewed tea, and they settled in the living room, sharing stories, filling the gaps of more than 2 decades apart. Stella spoke about her work at the Artisans Cooperative, how she eventually progressed from administrative assistant to bookkeeper, using skills she had developed working for Harrison. She spoke about the few friendships she had made, always maintaining emotional distance, always afraid that someone would discover her true identity. She spoke about the sleepless nights, imagining how Dana was doing, if she was okay, if she hated her. Dana, in turn, shared her own struggles, the jobs she secured after her grandmother's death, the growing determination to discover the truth about the past. It was then that Dana mentioned Owen Barrett again, and she saw her mother instantly stiffen. Stella asked, in a tense voice, if Harrison had said where Owen was now. Dana replied that, according to Harrison, he had moved to New York many years ago and was apparently doing well financially. Stella let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Of course he was, she said. Men like Owen always landed on their feet, always found ways to prosper at the expense of others. Dana realized her mother was still afraid of him, even after all these years, even with the physical and temporal distance. That fear had become part of who Stella was, shaping every decision, every action. Dana made a decision at that moment, looking at her mother's tired face. She said she was going to confront Owen, that she was going to make him answer for what he had done. Stella immediately panicked, gripping her daughter's arm with surprising strength. "No," she said vehemently. "Owen was dangerous. It wasn't worth the risk." Dana tried to argue, but Stella was nearly hysterical now, speaking rapidly about how Owen had no scruples, how he had demonstrated over the years a frightening capacity for manipulation and intimidation. It was then that Stella revealed something even Harrison didn't know. Owen had contacted Stella once, about 5 years after she left Charleston, just to remind her that he was still watching, still waiting for her to make a mistake. That revelation changed everything for Dana. It meant Owen had tracked Stella's location. It meant he maintained surveillance over her, even after he had gotten what he wanted. The level of cruelty and control was far greater than Dana had imagined. She held her mother's hands, promising she wouldn't do anything impulsive, that she would think carefully about the next steps. But internally, Dana knew she couldn't just let this go. Owen Barrett had destroyed her family's life, had forced a separation that caused immeasurable pain to both her and her mother. There had to be some way to hold him accountable, some way to achieve justice. The night was already late when Stella offered Dana the guest room. It was a small but tidy space, with a twin bed covered by a handmade patchwork quilt. Stella said one of the artisans from the cooperative had gifted her the quilt years ago, and she had always held on to the hope that one day she would have a special visitor who could use it. Dana hugged her mother again before retiring to the room, feeling for the first time in many years a sense of genuine connection with someone. She lay in bed, emotionally exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind spun in circles, processing everything she had discovered on that extraordinary day. Simultaneously, back in Charleston, Harrison also couldn't sleep. He had stayed home after Dana's departure, wandering through the empty rooms like a ghost, unable to concentrate on anything. He tried watching television, tried reading, tried working on some documents, but nothing held his attention. The image of Dana crouched beside his safe, holding those papers with trembling hands, was etched in his mind, as was the expression on her face when he admitted his cowardice. Around 2 in the morning, Harrison picked up his cell phone and opened his contacts list. He scrolled until he found a name he hadn't seen in over a decade: Owen Barrett. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching us from. Returning to the story. The number probably didn't even work anymore, Harrison thought, but his finger hovered over it nonetheless. Should he try to contact his former partner? Warn him that Dana was asking questions, that the secrets were coming to light. But no, he realized with a flash of clarity. Warning Owen would be repeating the same mistake from 23 years ago. It would be choosing the path of complicity again, instead of integrity. Harrison deleted Owen's contact from his phone with a quick movement before he could change his mind. It was a small, almost symbolic gesture, but it felt like a first step in the right direction. The next morning, Dana woke up to the smell of coffee and fresh toast. She went downstairs and found Stella in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with a lighter expression than the night before. They ate together, and there was something comforting in that simple domesticity, in the everyday act of sharing a meal. Stella mentioned she had the day off work and asked if Dana would like to see Asheville. They could visit the scenic park, the historic Grove Arcade, the gardens. Dana accepted, realizing they both needed that time together, needed to build new memories to replace the lost years. They spent the day exploring the city, talking about lighter subjects, laughing at small things. Stella showed Dana the artisans' cooperative where she worked, introduced Dana to some colleagues as her daughter, and for the first time in decades could say those words aloud without fear. The colleagues were surprised, as Stella had never mentioned having a daughter, but they were welcoming and kind. Dana saw how her mother had built a life here, modest but dignified, and felt a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in Stella's strength, sadness for all the years she had to live in hiding. In the late afternoon, as they were returning home, Dana's cell phone rang. It was a Charleston number she didn't recognize. She answered with hesitation and heard an unfamiliar male voice introduce himself as Albert, Harrison Caldwell's attorney. He said Harrison had asked him to contact Dana, that there were important matters to discuss. Dana frowned, asking what kind of matters. Albert was vague, only saying it involved historical company documents and information that might be relevant to Dana. She scheduled a meeting for 2 days later, when she planned to return to Charleston. When she hung up, Stella looked at her with concern. Dana explained about the lawyer's call, and she saw the tension return to her mother's shoulders. Stella asked if Dana really needed to go back to Charleston, if she couldn't simply stay there in Asheville, start over with her. Dana held her mother's hands and gently explained that she needed to finish what she had started. She needed to discover the whole truth, needed to see Harrison confront his own actions, needed to be sure that Owen could no longer hurt them. Stella started to protest, but Dana interrupted her, saying that this time would be different. This time, Stella wouldn't be alone facing his threats. This time, they would be together. But even as she spoke those reassuring words, Dana didn't tell her mother about the plan that was forming in her mind. A risky plan that involved confronting not just Harrison, but also Owen Barrett. She spent one more night at Stella's house, and in the morning prepared to drive back to Charleston. The farewell was emotional, but different from the previous one. This time, there were promises of return. Phone numbers were exchanged, and a shared future lay ahead. Stella held her daughter's face in her hands and made Dana promise to be careful, not to put herself at risk. Dana promised, even though she knew it was a promise she might not be able to keep. The drive back to Charleston seemed shorter, and Dana used the time to organize her thoughts. Dana arrived in the city late in the afternoon and went directly to Harrison's house, still using the key she had as staff. The house was silent when she entered, but she saw a light on in the upstairs study. She climbed the stairs and found Harrison sitting at his desk, surrounded by piles of old documents. He looked up when she entered, and there was something different in his expression, a determination she hadn't seen before. Harrison said he was glad she had returned, that there were things he needed to show her. He had spent the last 2 days combing through all the company's antique files, gathering evidence of Owen's fraud. Not just the embezzlement Stella had originally discovered, but additional years of irregularities that continued even after she left. Owen had been much more audacious than Harrison imagined, stealing substantial amounts over a decade. Dana asked why he was doing this now, after so long. Harrison replied with brutal honesty, because he was finally ashamed enough to act, because he could no longer live with the cowardice that had defined so many years of his life. Dana sat in the chair opposite the desk, and the two began reviewing the documents together. It was an impressive collection of evidence: suspicious transfers, false receipts, fraudulent contracts. With this, they could definitively prove that Owen had committed serious financial crimes. But there was a problem, Dana observed. Many of those crimes were likely already past the legal statute of limitations. Harrison agreed, but said it wasn't just about legal justice. It was about exposing the truth, about taking away the power Owen held over Stella through fear and secrecy. If the truth about his actions came to light, he could no longer threaten anyone with exposure, because he would be the one exposed. It was at that moment that Harrison's cell phone rang. He looked at the screen and visibly paled. He showed the name to Dana, Owen Barrett. Neither of them knew how he had gotten Harrison's current number or why he was calling after years of no contact. Harrison looked at Dana, seeking guidance, and she nodded, indicating he should answer. With a trembling hand, Harrison accepted the call and put it on speakerphone. Owen's voice cut through the device, confident and arrogant as ever. He said he would be in Charleston next week for business and would like to meet with Harrison to discuss a lucrative opportunity. The silence that followed Owen's call was dense and suffocating. Harrison had hung up the phone with shaking hands, and now he and Dana looked at each other across the desk, filled with incriminating documents, processing the unsettling coincidence of that contact just when they were gathering evidence against him. Dana was the first to break the silence, asking if Harrison thought Owen might know something, if there was any way he could have discovered they were investigating his past. Harrison shook his head negatively, but his expression betrayed uncertainty. Owen had always been astute, always seemed to have a sixth sense for situations that might threaten him, and the timing couldn't be more suspicious. Dana rose from the chair and walked to the window, observing the Charleston streets plunged into the darkness of the night. Her mind worked quickly, assessing possibilities and risks. She asked Harrison exactly when Owen said he would be in town, and Harrison replied it would be next Thursday, 6 days away. Enough time to prepare, Dana thought, but also enough time for anxiety and fear to grow. She turned to Harrison and said they needed to tell Stella about the call, that her mother deserved to know that the man who had terrorized her for decades was about to reappear in Charleston. Harrison agreed, but pointed out that the news would likely devastate Stella, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. That night, Dana called her mother from her room at the small guest house, where she had decided to stay instead of returning to Harrison's house. The conversation was difficult. As soon as Dana mentioned Owen's name, she heard Stella's breathing quicken on the other end of the line. When she explained about the call and the planned visit, there was a long silence before Stella could speak again. Her voice was thin and frightened as she asked if Dana was sure Owen was really coming, if it couldn't be some kind of mistake. Dana confirmed it was real, that Harrison had spoken directly with him. Stella started to cry, and through sobs she said Dana needed to leave Charleston immediately, that it wasn't safe to be there when Owen arrived. Dana tried to calm her mother, explaining that this time would be different, that they had evidence against Owen, that they weren't defenseless anymore. But Stella was inconsolable, repeating that Dana didn't understand how dangerous Owen could be, how far he was willing to go to protect his interests. The conversation ended with Stella imploring her daughter to at least be careful, not to confront Owen directly, to think about her own safety. Dana promised to be cautious, But when she hung up the phone, she knew she couldn't simply run away. Something bigger than her own safety was at stake now. It was about breaking the cycle of fear that had controlled her mother's life for so many years. The following days passed in a haze of preparation and mounting anxiety. Harrison and Dana met daily in the study, continuing to catalogue the evidence against Owen, organizing everything clearly and chronologically. Harrison contacted his attorney, Albert, and together they began assessing what legal options were still available despite the time elapsed. Albert was a meticulous and serious middle-aged man who listened to the entire story with an increasingly grave expression. He explained that although many of the financial crimes were past the statute of limitations for criminal charges, there was still the possibility of civil action, in addition to the fact that publicly exposing Owen's fraud could have significant repercussions on his current reputation and businesses. Dana insisted on being present for all these conversations, asking detailed questions, taking notes. Harrison noted the transformation in her, how the woman who had worked silently in his kitchen for months had become a determined and focused force. There was a resilience in Dana that he vaguely recognized from Stella, but also something new, a toughness forged by years of abandonment and the need to survive alone. During a break in one of these meetings with Albert, Harrison pulled Dana aside and asked if she truly wanted to go through with this, if the risk was worth it. Dana looked him in the eye and answered without hesitation that yes, for the first time in her life, she felt she was doing something that mattered, something that could bring genuine peace to her mother. It was on Tuesday, 2 days before Owen's scheduled arrival, that the first unexpected twist occurred. Harrison received an email from an unknown address, with no subject line, containing only an attachment. When he opened the file, he found scanned copies of documents he had never seen before, records of financial transactions involving his company, but dated from much more recent periods, within the last 5 years. The transactions showed substantial transfers to offshore accounts, amounts reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars. Harrison was initially confused, not recognizing the movements, until he realized with growing horror that the documents were forged to make it look like Harrison was the one currently embezzling money. Dana was beside him when he made this discovery, and together they examined the false documents with increasing alarm. They were well made, convincing enough to cause serious problems if presented to authorities or made public. Harrison's signature had been forged with disturbing precision. The company stamps looked authentic. Even the bank account numbers were real, just manipulated to suggest irregularities. There was no accompanying message with the email, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning, a demonstration of power. Someone wanted Harrison to know that he could be framed just as easily as he was trying to frame others. Harrison immediately thought of Owen. Who else would have the motivation to do something like this? Who else would have access to enough information about the company to create such convincing forgeries? But something didn't make sense. How would Owen know they were gathering evidence against him? Harrison had been extremely careful, sharing his plans with no one but Dana and Albert, and he trusted both completely. Dana suggested that perhaps Owen was just being preemptive, that maybe the lucrative business opportunity he had called about was actually a way to gauge whether Harrison posed a threat. Albert, when consulted about the forged documents, was visibly worried and advised extreme caution. That night, Dana couldn't sleep. She stayed awake in the small guest house, mentally reviewing everything that had happened since that afternoon. She confronted Harrison in his study. The more she thought, the more she realized that something was wrong with the whole situation. Owen's call had been too convenient, the timing too suspicious. And now these forged documents appearing just when they planned to confront him. It was as if someone was always one step ahead of them, anticipating their moves. Around 3 in the morning, Dana had a disturbing thought. What if it wasn't Owen orchestrating this? What if there was someone else involved, someone they hadn't considered? On Wednesday morning, the day before Owen's scheduled arrival, Dana received a call from Stella that would completely change her understanding of the situation. Her mother was visibly agitated, speaking quickly, almost incoherently. She said she had received an unexpected visit the night before, a woman named Myrtle, who claimed to have worked with Owen in New York for years. Myrtle had found Stella because she, too, was looking for information about Owen, and also had her own reasons for wanting to see him held accountable for his actions. And what Myrtle told Stella shed a completely new light on the entire situation. According to Myrtle, Owen wasn't just an opportunistic fraudster who skimmed money from companies. He had turned it into a systematic pattern over the decades. After leaving Charleston and moving to New York, Owen repeated the same scheme at other companies. He gained trust, assumed positions of power, diverted resources, and when discovered or threatened with discovery, he used blackmail and intimidation to silence his victims. Myrtle was one of those victims, an accountant who had discovered Owen's fraud at an import company where they both worked. When she threatened to report him, Owen used similar tactics to those he had employed with Stella: veiled threats, compromising information, psychological intimidation. But there was more. Myrtle revealed that Owen didn't work alone. He had a partner, someone who helped him with the technical side of the fraud, someone specialized in manipulating documents and financial systems. This partner was the one who created the convincing forgeries, who erased digital tracks, who ensured Owen could always deny involvement if things went wrong. And Myrtle had reason to believe this partner was still working with Owen, still assisting him in his schemes. Stella asked if Myrtle knew who this partner was, but the woman wasn't sure of the name, only that it was someone with advanced knowledge in accounting and technology. Dana hung up the phone with her mind racing. The forged documents Harrison had received suddenly made much more sense. They weren't just a warning from Owen, they were a demonstration of his partner's capabilities, a way to show they could fabricate evidence against anyone who threatened them. She immediately called Harrison and shared what she had discovered. Harrison was silent for a long moment before saying something that made Dana's blood run cold. He thought he knew who Owen's partner might be. During the years after Owen left the company, Harrison had hired a new accountant, a man named Reggie Travis, who coincidentally had previously worked at a firm in New York where Owen had contacts. The possibility that Reggie could be secretly working with Owen, that he could have access to all of Harrison's company's financial systems, was terrifying. It meant their every move could be monitored, that every document they reviewed could be reported back to Owen. Harrison said he needed to check that suspicion immediately, that he couldn't continue without knowing if he had a traitor within his own company. Dana agreed, but warned that they needed to be extremely careful. If Reggie truly was working with Owen, confronting him directly could be dangerous and counterproductive. They decided to set a trap. Dana looked him in the eye and answered without hesitation that yes, for the first time in her life, she felt she was doing something that mattered, something that could bring genuine peace to her mother. It was on Tuesday, 2 days before Owen's scheduled arrival, that Harrison created a false document containing incorrect information about his upcoming actions against Owen, and left that document where Reggie could easily access it through the company's systems. If the information in that document reached Owen, they would know for sure that there was a leak and that Reggie was the culprit. It was risky, but it seemed like the only way to confirm their suspicions without alerting the potential traitor. Harrison prepared the document that same afternoon, a letter addressed to Albert detailing a fictitious plan to deliver the evidence against Owen directly to the local press on Friday morning. While Harrison implemented the trap, Dana decided to investigate Reggie on her own. She went to the factory for the first time since she had stopped working as a cook at Harrison's house, causing surprise among the employees who only knew her in that former capacity. Reggie worked in a small office in the administrative sector, a thin man in his 40s with thinning hair and thin-rimmed glasses. Dana observed him discreetly through the glass window of his office, watching him work intently on his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard with impressive speed. There was something about the intensity of his concentration that made her uncomfortable, a visceral feeling that this man was hiding more than he let on. Dana spoke with some of the older employees, asking seemingly casual questions about Reggie. She discovered he was competent but distant, never participated in staff gatherings, never shared details about his personal life. Some employees mentioned that he often stayed working late, long after everyone else had left. One employee commented that he once arrived early and saw Reggie leaving the archives room where the company's historical documents were stored, which was strange since those files had nothing to do with his current work as an accountant. Armed with this information, Dana met with Harrison again at the end of the afternoon. They decided they needed to act fast. Owen would arrive the next day, Thursday, and they needed to know before then if Reggie was truly a threat. Harrison proposed doing something risky, breaking into Reggie's office after hours and searching for evidence of his connection to Owen. It was technically illegal, and Albert certainly would advise against it if he knew, but both felt they had no choice. The situation had escalated beyond the point where they could simply wait and react. They needed to be proactive. At 8 o'clock that evening, long after all the factory employees had left, Harrison and Dana returned to the building. Harrison had keys to all the offices, being the company owner, so accessing Reggie's room was not a problem. The space was surprisingly impersonal, with no family photographs or personal items, just organized stacks of documents and a desktop computer that remained on. Dana started searching the drawers while Harrison tried to access the computer, but found it required a password. They searched for almost an hour, carefully examining every paper, every folder, every corner of that sterile office. It was Dana who finally found something. At the bottom of the last drawer, hidden beneath a pile of old receipts, was a small flash drive. Harrison took it with trembling hands and plugged it into his own laptop that he had brought with him. The device contained a single password-protected folder, but Harrison had some knowledge of technology and managed to bypass the protection using a simple program. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. There were years of correspondence between Reggie and Owen, discussing not only the old frauds in Charleston, but also more recent schemes at other companies. There were detailed instructions on how to manipulate accounting records, how to create false documents, how to cover digital tracks. More disturbing still, there were recent emails from the past few days in which Reggie informed Owen about Harrison and Dana's activities. He had monitored Harrison's access to the old files, noticed the meetings with Albert, and even discovered the flash drive hidden in Harrison's study containing the original evidence. Owen's response emails were calculating and cold, giving precise instructions on how to proceed, how to use the information, when to act. The last email, dated that same morning, instructed Reggie to prepare a complete set of false documents implicating Harrison in recent fraud, documents that would be anonymously discovered by authorities should Harrison try to expose Owen. Dana felt nausea rise in her throat as she read those emails. The extent of the manipulation, the cold and methodical planning, the total lack of remorse or hesitation in destroying lives to protect their own interests, was shocking, even knowing the kind of man Owen was. Harrison copied all the files from the flash drive to his own computer, creating multiple backup copies. Those correspondences were explosive evidence, proving not only past frauds, but also recent criminal activities that were definitely not past the statute of limitations. With this, they could expose both Owen and Reggie, potentially leading to serious legal consequences for both. But there was a problem. As soon as Reggie realized his flash drive had been discovered, he would alert Owen, and both would disappear or destroy evidence before they could be held accountable. Harrison and Dana needed to act fast, but they also needed to be strategic. They decided to leave the flash drive exactly where they found it, giving no indication that they had been there. Then they would leave the factory and immediately call Albert, regardless of the hour, to show him the evidence and determine the next legal steps. Little did they know that while they were in Reggie's office, Reggie himself was sitting in his car in the factory parking lot, watching the lights on in the administrative building through binoculars. He had developed a habit of making random checks of the company outside of business hours, especially since Owen had warned him to watch out for suspicious moves by Harrison. When he saw two figures moving through the windows of the second floor, where his office was located, Reggie immediately knew something was wrong. He grabbed his cell phone and called Owen, who answered on the first ring despite it being almost 10 at night. Reggie reported what he was seeing, and Owen ordered him not to interfere yet, but just to observe and report. They couldn't risk a direct confrontation that might alert the authorities or create evidence of their own questionable actions. Better to let Harrison and Dana think they were operating undetected, while in reality their every move was being monitored and accounted for. Owen told Reggie that he would advance his arrival in Charleston to that very night, that it was time to end this situation once and for all. The tone in his voice was cold and determined, in a way that made even Reggie, accustomed to his manipulative tactics, feel a chill of apprehension. When Harrison and Dana finally left the factory, carrying the evidence copied from Reggie's flash drive, they didn't notice the dark car parked in the shadows across the street, nor the thin man sitting at the wheel, speaking softly into his cell phone. They drove directly to Albert's office, who, despite the late hour, agreed to meet with them immediately once Harrison explained the urgency of the situation. Albert lived in a comfortable house on the outskirts of Charleston, and received them in his home office, still wearing casual clothes, a look of deep concern etched on his face. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing the evidence, with Albert asking detailed questions, taking meticulous notes, assessing the legal implications of each discovery. His conclusion was clear. They had more than enough material to not only publicly expose Owen and Reggie, but also for legal proceedings that could result in prison sentences for both. The recent frauds documented in the emails were not past the statute of limitations, and the evidence of ongoing conspiracy was solid. Albert said that first thing the next morning, Thursday, he would personally take that evidence to a trusted prosecutor, formally initiating a criminal investigation. Dana asked if they should cancel the meeting Owen had scheduled with Harrison for Thursday, but Albert advised them to let it proceed as normal. The less Owen suspected they knew everything, the better. Let him come for his business meeting, thinking he was in control of the situation, while the authorities would already be aware of his crimes. Harrison agreed, though his voice trembled slightly as he accepted the plan. Dana, on the other hand, felt a grim satisfaction, imagining the look on Owen's face when he finally realized his web of manipulation was unraveling. It was nearly midnight when Dana finally returned to her guest house. She was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained by the events of the last few days. But there was also a sense of anticipation, an awareness that things were reaching a decisive point. She called Stella before going to sleep, telling her about the discoveries but omitting the most disturbing details so as not to alarm her mother further. Stella listened in silence, and when Dana finished, she said something that made her daughter pause. She asked Dana, regardless of what happened, not to let the desire for revenge consume her the way fear had consumed Stella herself all those years. Dana promised to be careful, but as she lay down on the narrow guest house bed, she wondered if it wasn't already too late for that promise. There was something growing inside her, something dark and intense that went beyond the simple pursuit of justice. It was a need to see Owen fall, to witness his destruction in the same way he had destroyed so many lives. She knew that feeling wasn't healthy, that it bordered on obsession, but she couldn't shake it off. Perhaps, she thought before finally falling into a restless sleep, that kind of intensity was exactly what would be needed to finally end this once and for all. Across town, in a discreet hotel near the bus station, Owen Barrett checked into his room, a small suitcase beside him containing everything he would need for the next few days. He had arrived in Charleston 3 hours earlier than planned, driving through the night after receiving Reggie's call. At 62, Owen still maintained the upright posture and confident expression he had always used as armor against the world. His hair, completely white now, was impeccably groomed, and his expensive clothes suggested the financial success he had built on decades of fraud and manipulation. He opened his laptop and reviewed the emails Reggie had sent him one more time, a cold smile playing on his lips as he read about Harrison and Dana's naive attempts to gather evidence against him, unaware that their every move was being watched and documented. Thursday morning dawned with a heavy sky over Charleston, thick clouds promising rain that hadn't yet arrived. Dana woke up early, anxiety not allowing her to sleep past 6 in the morning. She took a quick shower at the guest house, dressed carefully, choosing sober and practical clothes, and went out for a walk through the still empty streets of the historic downtown. She needed to organize her thoughts before the day truly began, before the events they had planned unfolded. She walked past the main square, where a few merchants were already opening their shops, and sat on a bench under a leafy tree, watching the city awaken around her. There was something comforting in that normalcy, in those people going about their routines, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. At 8 in the morning, Albert called, confirming he was on his way to the district attorney's office with all the evidence against Owen and Reggie. He sounded confident, professional, but Dana could detect a note of tension in his voice. It wasn't every day that an attorney found himself involved in something of this magnitude, exposing frauds that spanned decades. Albert said it would take a few hours to present everything properly to the prosecutor, that he would need to explain the full context, the story involving Stella, the threats, the years of forced silence. Dana thanked him and hung up, feeling a tight knot in her stomach. The gears of justice were finally beginning to turn, but everything still felt so fragile, as if it could collapse at any moment. Harrison met her for breakfast at a small diner near the guest house. He was visibly nervous, obsessively stirring his coffee cup without actually drinking, his eyes marked by deep dark circles that betrayed a sleepless night. Dana noticed his hands trembled slightly as he held the cup, and felt an unexpected pang of compassion. Harrison had been cowardly. He had failed her mother terribly, but now he was trying to do the right thing, even if decades late. There was courage in that too, she thought. Courage to face his own mistakes, to risk everything he had built for the sake of a justice that would not directly benefit him. They spoke little during breakfast, both lost in their own thoughts, mentally preparing for what was to come. The meeting with Owen was scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon at Harrison's office in the factory. He had suggested that neutral location instead of his home, wanting to maintain some professional distance from the encounter. Dana planned to be present too, hidden in an adjacent room from where she could hear everything through an intercom that Harrison would discreetly install. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best way to ensure there was a witness to everything said without alerting Owen to the fact that he wasn't dealing only with Harrison. Albert had advised against confronting Owen directly about the frauds during that meeting, instructing Harrison to simply listen to what he had to say, be cordial but not compromising, and let the authorities handle the formal accusations. At 2 in the afternoon, Harrison and Dana were at the factory, making the final preparations. Harrison installed a small intercom hidden beneath his desk, testing it several times to ensure Dana could hear clearly from the next room. Dana positioned herself in that cramped space that served as an archive storage room, surrounded by shelves full of old folders and dusty boxes. There was an uncomfortable chair where she sat, clutching her cell phone with sweaty hands, ready to record everything said should they need the additional evidence. The wait was agonizing, every minute dragging like an hour, the silence of the factory in the middle of the afternoon weighing on them like a stifling blanket. At 3 o'clock sharp, Harrison's secretary called, informing him that he had a visitor. Harrison took a deep breath, nervously smoothed his tie, and told her to send him up. Dana heard through the intercom the footsteps approaching down the corridor, the office door opening, and then a voice she had never personally heard, but immediately recognized from her mother's descriptions. It was a deep, confident voice, loaded with the arrogance of someone accustomed to being in control. Owen Barrett greeted Harrison with false cordiality, commenting on how the factory had grown since he was last there, making seemingly casual remarks that carried a subtext of possessiveness, as if he still considered the place partially his. Harrison offered coffee, which Owen accepted, and the first few minutes of conversation were filled with empty pleasantries. Owen spoke about New York, about the businesses he had built there, about opportunities and investments. His voice was hypnotic in a way, Dana thought, listening through the intercom, the kind of voice that inspired confidence even when it shouldn't. She understood now how he had managed to manipulate so many people over the years, how he had built that entire network of fraud without being discovered for so long. There was a chameleon-like quality to him, an ability to adapt to what each situation required, to say exactly what people wanted to hear. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching us from. Returning to the story. Finally, Owen got to the point. He said he had an investment opportunity he wanted to propose to Harrison, a chance to expand the factory significantly through a partnership with investors from New York whom Owen knew. The numbers he mentioned were impressive. Millions of dollars in available capital, access to new markets, exponential growth potential. But as Owen detailed the proposal, Dana began to notice the traps hidden in the fine print. The structure he described would give the investors significant control over the company's operations, unrestricted access to financial records, authority to make important decisions without necessarily consulting Harrison. It was a takeover disguised as a business opportunity. Harrison, to his credit, asked intelligent questions, pointing out inconsistencies in the proposal without directly accusing Owen of bad faith. He asked about the specific identity of these investors, about legal guarantees, about governance structures. Owen had prepared answers for everything, answers that sounded plausible superficially but crumbled under closer examination. Dana realized Harrison was playing a dangerous game, keeping Owen engaged in conversation without committing to anything, buying time while Albert worked with the authorities. It was then that something none of them expected happened. Owen casually mentioned that he had met with Reggie Travis the previous night. The silence that followed that revelation was heavy. Harrison clearly didn't expect Owen to openly admit his connection to Reggie, and it took him a moment to regain his composure. Owen continued, saying that Reggie had mentioned some concerns about irregularities he had noticed in the company's recent financial records, irregularities that could attract unwanted attention from auditors or tax authorities if they weren't corrected properly. The tone was casual, but the implied threat was crystal clear. Owen was making it obvious that he had the means to create problems for Harrison through the false documents Reggie had prepared, and that the investment opportunity was actually a way for Harrison to avoid those problems by accepting a deal on Owen's terms. Dana felt rage boil within her as she listened. Owen's sheer audacity, the way he calmly blackmailed Harrison using the same tactics he had employed against her mother decades ago, was unbearable. She had to press her hand over her mouth to avoid making any sound that might reveal her presence. Harrison, on the other side of the wall, was visibly struggling to maintain his calm. His voice was tense when he replied that he would need time to consider the proposal, that decisions of that magnitude couldn't be made hastily. Owen smiled. Dana could hear the smile in his voice, and said that of course he understood perfectly. But that time was of the essence, and he would expect an answer by the end of the week. It was at that moment that the office door burst open abruptly, and Reggie Travis entered without knocking, a look of poorly contained panic on his face. He said he needed to speak with Harrison urgently, privately, about a critical matter that had just arisen. Harrison started to say he was in a meeting, but Reggie interrupted him, insisting that it was extremely urgent and couldn't wait. Owen watched the scene with calculated interest, his eyes narrowed, assessing the situation. Dana, listening through the intercom, felt her heart race. Something had gone wrong. Reggie must have discovered that his flash drive had been accessed, or perhaps Albert had already presented the evidence to the authorities, and the news had somehow leaked. Harrison, realizing he had no choice, apologized to Owen and left the office with Reggie, closing the door behind him. Dana could hear muffled voices in the corridor, Reggie speaking quickly and Harrison replying in low tones. Through the intercom, she heard Owen moving around the office, his footsteps circling, and then a sound that made her freeze. He was opening drawers, rummaging through Harrison's desk. Owen was taking advantage of those moments alone to search for something, likely the evidence he knew Harrison had gathered against him. Dana heard drawers opening and closing, papers rustling, the sound of Owen muttering something to himself. Harrison returned to the office a few minutes later, and Owen was sitting back in the visitor's chair, composed and calm, as if he had done nothing. Reggie did not enter with him, and Harrison briefly explained that it had been a minor issue with a client that Reggie had resolved. The lie was obvious, but Owen didn't question it. Instead, he stood up, smoothing his expensive suit, and said he had to leave, but eagerly awaited Harrison's answer regarding the proposal. They said goodbye with a handshake that Dana imagined was as false as their entire interaction had been, and then Owen left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they disappeared. As soon as she was sure Owen had left the building, Dana emerged from her hiding place and found Harrison in the office, sitting heavily in his chair with his face in his hands. She asked what Reggie had said, and Harrison raised tired eyes to her. Reggie had discovered that his flash drive had been accessed. He had monitoring systems installed that alerted him when specific files were opened, and those alerts had come in the previous night. Reggie was panicking, convinced that Harrison was going to the authorities, and had come to beg him not to, offering to turn in Owen in exchange for immunity for himself. Harrison told him it was too late for deals, that the evidence was already with the authorities, and that both Reggie and Owen would have to answer for their crimes. Dana asked where Reggie was now, and Harrison said he had run out of the building shortly after the conversation, likely to warn Owen about what was happening. This meant Owen now knew they had been exposed, that the authorities were involved, that his carefully constructed game was collapsing. Dana felt a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. Satisfaction because Owen was finally being held accountable, but apprehension because men like him, when cornered, could become unpredictable and dangerous. Harrison shared the same concern and said they should call Albert immediately to update him on the developments. Albert answered on the second ring, and his voice sounded tense but triumphant. He had just come out of a 3-hour meeting with the district attorney, and the news was better than they expected. The DA was extremely interested in the case, especially given the solid evidence and the extent of the frauds over time. He had immediately authorized the opening of a formal criminal investigation, and search and seizure warrants were being prepared for both Owen's and Reggie's offices. More significantly, the prosecutor was considering the possibility of pre-trial detention for both, given the risk of flight and destruction of evidence. Albert said the authorities would likely act within the next 24 hours and advised Harrison and Dana to stay safe and available should their testimonies be needed. After hanging up with Albert, Harrison and Dana sat in silence for long minutes, processing everything that had happened. It was truly ending, Dana thought. After decades of impunity, Owen would finally face real consequences for his actions. She thought of her mother, of all the years Stella had lived in fear, hidden, separated from her daughter. She thought of all Owen's other victims over the years, people like Myrtle who had been intimidated into silence. Finally, there would be justice. But even as she felt that satisfaction, Dana couldn't completely shake the feeling that something could still go wrong, that Owen might have one more trick hidden, a final manipulation prepared. That night, Dana called Stella and told her everything that had happened. Her mother listened in silence, and when Dana finished, there was a long pause before Stella spoke. Her voice was laden with emotion when she said she couldn't believe it was really ending, that after so many years living with that burden, she could finally breathe freely. She asked if Dana thought it was safe to come to Charleston, if she could be there when Owen was arrested. Dana said yes, that it would be good to have her mother nearby, that they had spent too much time apart. Stella promised to hit the road the next morning, Friday, and be in Charleston by noon. But while Dana and Stella made their plans, and while Harrison finally managed to sleep for the first time in days, knowing he had done the right thing, Owen Barrett was sitting in his hotel room, his laptop open in front of him, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He was not panicking. He was not running. Instead, he was calmly executing contingency plans he had prepared years ago for exactly this type of situation. Bank transfers were being made, moving money through a complex network of offshore accounts that would take authorities years to trace. Digital documents were being erased through sophisticated programs that ensured they could not be recovered. Contacts were being activated, people in strategic positions who owed Owen favors and who were now called upon to repay them. Reggie was with him in the room, pacing like a caged animal, nervously muttering about prison and lawyers. Owen largely ignored him, focused on his tasks. When he finished the transfers and deletions, he finally looked at Reggie and said calmly that it was time to leave, that New York was too big for them to be easily found, that they had enough resources to disappear if necessary. Reggie eagerly agreed, grabbing his already packed bag. But before they could leave the room, Owen's phone rang. It was one of his contacts, someone who worked in the judicial system and had promised to alert him if any official action were initiated against him. The conversation was brief, and when Owen hung up, there was an expression of cold determination on his face. Search and seizure warrants would be executed Friday morning at 6 o'clock. They had less than 12 hours before the authorities came after them. More than enough time to disappear, Owen told Reggie. But first, there was something they needed to do. When Reggie asked what, Owen smiled that cold smile that never reached his eyes, and said they needed to ensure that certain people couldn't testify against them. Reggie paled, understanding the implication, but did not protest. He was too deeply involved now to have scruples. At Harrison's house, the businessman had finally managed to sleep, exhausted by the day's events. He did not hear the discreet sound of a downstairs window being forced around 2 in the morning. He did not notice the silent footsteps climbing the stairs toward his bedroom. He only woke when he felt a hand covering his mouth and saw the silhouette of Reggie Travis leaning over his bed, holding something that shone faintly in the darkness. Before Harrison could react, he felt a sharp prick in his arm, and the world began to darken around him. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness was Owen's voice, coming from somewhere in the room, calmly saying that this didn't have to happen, that if Harrison had just accepted the proposal and kept quiet, none of this would be necessary. When Harrison woke up, he had no idea how much time had passed. He was in a dark, cold place, lying on a concrete floor, his hands tied behind his back and a throbbing pain in his head. He tried to scream, but there was something covering his mouth, duct tape that prevented him from making more than muffled sounds. His eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, and he realized he was in a type of abandoned warehouse or storage facility, with high windows covered by boards, allowing only thin rays of light to enter. He heard voices coming from somewhere nearby, immediately recognizing Owen's and Reggie's discussing in low, tense tones what to do next. Harrison tried to move, to find some way to free himself, but the restraints were too tight. Panic began to take hold when he realized the seriousness of his situation. Owen had crossed a line Harrison hadn't thought he would, moving from fraud and intimidation to something much more dangerous, and Harrison was completely at his mercy, alone, with no one knowing where he was. His only hope was that Dana would notice his absence when he didn't show up in the morning, that she and Albert would be able to figure out what had happened before it was too late. But as he lay there on the cold floor of that warehouse, listening to Owen and Reggie discuss his fate in voices he could barely distinguish, Harrison Caldwell faced for the first time in his life the real possibility that his past mistakes had finally reached consequences from which there would be no return. Dana woke up on Friday with a strange feeling of unease that she couldn't explain. It was just past 7 in the morning, and the sun was already shining through the thin curtain of the guest house room, promising a clear day after the threat of rain the day before. She picked up her cell phone to check messages and frowned when she saw nothing from Harrison. They had agreed to meet at 8 for breakfast, and he usually sent a confirming text, but this time there was only silence. Dana tried to call, but the call went straight to voicemail, as if the phone were turned off. A pang of worry shot through her chest, but she tried to push it away, telling herself Harrison was probably just sleeping soundly after the stressful days they had endured. She showered and dressed quickly, then walked to the small diner where they had planned to meet. She ordered a coffee and waited, watching the clock move slowly. 8:15, 8:30, 9 o'clock. Harrison was never this late. Dana tried calling again with the same result, straight to voicemail. The worry now transformed into something more intense, a visceral feeling that something was terribly wrong. She paid for the coffee she hadn't even touched, and went straight to Harrison's house, her heart beating faster and faster as she drove through the Charleston streets that were slowly gaining movement with the start of the workday. Harrison's house was silent when Dana arrived. His car was parked out front, which meant he was home, but there was no response when she rang the doorbell repeatedly. Dana used the key she still had from when she worked there as a cook, and entered, calling his name. Her voice echoed through the empty mansion without reply. She rushed up the stairs, her heart now hammering against her ribs, and went straight to Harrison's bedroom. The bed was unmade, as if he had left it in a hurry or been taken from it. The covers were on the floor, a pillow tossed far away. There were clear signs of a struggle, objects knocked off the bedside table, and when Dana looked more closely, she saw strange marks on the carpet near the bed, as if something heavy had been dragged. Dana felt panic rise in her throat. She grabbed her cell phone with trembling hands and called Albert, who answered after several rings with a sleepy voice. When she explained the situation, he immediately became alert, telling her not to touch anything else and that he would be there in 15 minutes. Dana walked down the stairs slowly, examining the rest of the house for more clues. On the ground floor, she found a kitchen window that had been forced open, the latch broken, small fragments of glass on the floor. Someone had broken into the house during the night. Someone had taken Harrison. And Dana knew exactly who: Owen Barrett, aided by Reggie Travis. Albert arrived in less than 10 minutes, accompanied by a private investigator who occasionally worked for him on complex cases. The man was named Marcus, about 50 years old, a former cop who now operated independently. He examined the house methodically, asking precise questions, taking photographs, analyzing every detail. His conclusion confirmed Dana's worst fears. There were definitely signs of intrusion and struggle, and based on the evidence, Harrison had likely been drugged and removed from the house during the early morning hours. Marcus said they needed to involve the authorities immediately, that this was a kidnapping and required an urgent police response. Albert was already on the phone with the prosecutor he had met with the day before, explaining the situation in a grave and urgent tone. The prosecutor was visibly alarmed to learn of Harrison's disappearance just as the search warrants against Owen and Reggie were about to be executed. He said he would redirect resources immediately. Instead of just search and seizure, they were now dealing with a kidnapping investigation. Teams would be mobilized, Harrison's house would be treated as a crime scene, and an intensive search for Owen, Reggie, and Harrison would begin immediately. Albert hung up and looked at Dana with a somber expression, saying they had underestimated how far Owen was willing to go to protect himself. Dana felt rage boil within her, so intense that for a moment she couldn't speak. When she finally found her voice, she said they couldn't simply wait for the authorities to find Harrison. Owen was too smart, too much of a planner. He would have hidden Harrison somewhere difficult to find quickly. They needed to think like Owen thought, anticipate his moves. Marcus agreed, saying that in kidnapping cases, the first few hours were absolutely critical. The more time passed, the greater the risk to the victim. He suggested they start investigating properties that Owen or Reggie might have access to in Charleston or the surrounding areas, isolated places where they could keep someone hidden. It was then that Dana remembered something. When she was searching the emails on Reggie's flash drive, she had seen mentions of a depot in some of the old correspondence, a place Owen had used in the past to store documents that needed to be kept away from prying eyes. She hadn't paid much attention at the time because it seemed irrelevant, but now it acquired new importance. Dana grabbed her laptop from her bag and opened the files she had copied from the flash drive, frantically searching for those references. She found 3 different emails over 5 years mentioning the depot in the industrial park, always in contexts that suggested it was a location only Owen and Reggie knew about. Marcus immediately took that information and started making calls, using his contacts in the city to identify properties in the Charleston Industrial Park that might be registered under shell companies or that were abandoned. Within half an hour, he had a list of 6 possible locations. Albert wanted to wait for the authorities to investigate, but Dana said they couldn't afford to waste time. Every minute that passed was one more minute. Harrison was in the hands of desperate men who had nothing to lose. Marcus agreed with her, saying they would do a discreet reconnaissance of each location, no confrontation, just to identify where Harrison might be before calling for backup. They left together in Marcus's car, a discreet sedan that wouldn't draw attention. Dana sent a quick text to Stella, who was on her way to Charleston, telling her about Harrison's disappearance, but omitting the most alarming details so as not to panic her mother while driving. The Charleston Industrial Park was on the outskirts of the city, an area of warehouses, small factories, and storage depots where movement was minimal on weekends. Being Friday morning, there was some activity, trucks making deliveries, workers entering and leaving buildings, but also many structures that looked abandoned or underutilized. The first location on the list was a large hangar that had belonged to a defunct distribution company. Marcus parked at a safe distance, and they observed for a few minutes, but the place had clearly been empty for a long time, with broken windows and vegetation growing in the parking lot cracks. The second was a smaller depot that was still in use, with constant employee movement, ruling it out as a possibility. The third seemed more promising, a medium-sized warehouse that appeared abandoned but showed signs of recent activity. Fresh tire tracks at the dirt entrance, some debris that didn't look very old. Marcus decided to make a closer approach. He told Dana to stay in the car while he investigated, but she flatly refused. They had come this far together, and she wouldn't wait while Harrison could be just meters away, possibly injured or in danger. Marcus reluctantly agreed, but made Dana promise she would stay behind him, and that at the first sign of danger she would run back to the car and call the authorities. They approached the warehouse from a side where the vegetation offered some cover, moving silently, alert to any sound or movement. The warehouse had high windows covered by boards, exactly as Harrison had described in his own perception when he woke up kidnapped. Marcus found one of the boards that was loose and managed to move it enough to peek through the dirty window. He stood motionless for long seconds, observing, and then turned to Dana with a tense expression and nodded affirmatively. Someone was inside. Dana felt her heart pound. She whispered, asking if it was Harrison, and Marcus said he couldn't see clearly, but there were definitely at least 2 people inside the warehouse, and one of them appeared to be on the floor. Marcus reached for his cell phone to call the authorities, but before he could complete the call, they heard the sound of an approaching engine. A car was arriving at the warehouse, a dark sedan that parked near the main entrance. Marcus and Dana ducked down behind the vegetation, watching as the driver's door opened and Owen Barrett stepped out, casually stretching his body as if he were just arriving for another ordinary workday. He looked around with those calculating eyes, and for one terrifying moment Dana was certain he would see them, but then he turned and entered the warehouse, the metal door closing behind him with an echo that sounded like a funeral bell. Marcus urgently whispered into the phone, reporting the location and situation to the authorities. He was instructed not to do anything, to remain hidden and await the arrival of the police teams that were en route. But Dana couldn't simply wait. Harrison was inside, possibly injured, definitely in danger, and Owen was with him now. Who knew what he planned to do? She told Marcus she was going to take a closer look, perhaps find another window from which she could better see what was happening inside. Marcus tried to stop her, but Dana was already moving, staying low, using the building's shadows for cover. She managed to reach a side door that was slightly ajar, likely left that way by Owen when he entered. Through the crack, Dana could see the interior of the warehouse. Harrison was there, tied to a chair in the center of the empty space, his head bowed but clearly conscious. Owen was standing in front of him, speaking, although Dana couldn't hear the words. Reggie was a few feet behind, pacing nervously, hands in his hair, visibly panicking. The whole scene had a surreal and terrifying quality, like something out of a nightmare unfolding in the harsh reality of daylight. Dana felt her hands begin to tremble when she saw Owen move closer to Harrison, leaning in to speak directly into his face. Even without hearing the words, she could feel the threat in his posture, the way he invaded Harrison's personal space, using his position of power over a defenseless, bound man. Reggie said something that made Owen turn abruptly, and the 2 men began to argue, their voices rising enough for Dana to catch fragments. Reggie wanted to leave immediately, thought they had wasted too much time, that the authorities could arrive at any moment. Owen replied with contempt in his voice, saying they wouldn't leave loose ends, that Harrison knew too much and had to be dealt with properly before they could leave. Dana's stomach churned as she understood what dealt with properly likely meant. Owen was genuinely considering doing something terrible to Harrison to silence him permanently. She looked around desperately, searching for something, anything she could use to help. Marcus appeared silently beside her, having followed her despite his instructions to stay behind. He whispered that the police were 5 minutes away, that they just needed to keep the situation stable until then. But Dana could see that 5 minutes might be too long. The argument between Owen and Reggie was heating up, and Harrison was clearly trying to say something through the duct tape over his mouth, his eyes wide with urgency or fear. It was then that the second major, unforeseen twist occurred. The main door of the warehouse burst open abruptly, and Stella Fields walked in, alone, unarmed, with no apparent plan. Just a desperate mother who had arrived in Charleston earlier than planned, and, upon learning of the kidnapping through Dana's message, had used her own contacts to track where Owen might be. She stopped just past the entrance, and for a frozen moment in time, everyone in the warehouse simply stared at her in absolute shock. Owen was the first to react, his face cycling through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, recognition, and then something that could almost be mistaken for fear before transforming into cold anger. Stella walked toward the center of the warehouse with firm steps, even though Dana could see her hands trembling. Her voice came out clear and strong when she spoke Owen's name, not as a question, but as an accusation. 23 years of repressed anger, of fear forced into silence, of destroyed lives, all contained in those 2 syllables. Owen quickly recovered his composure, a cruel smile forming on his lips as he said he was surprised to see her, that he thought she would have learned her lesson about meddling in affairs that didn't concern her. Stella retorted that this had everything to do with her, that he had stolen years of her life, separated her from her daughter, forced her to live as a fugitive when she had done nothing wrong. The confrontation between Stella and Owen was charged with decades of unresolved history, and Dana watched through the crack in the side door with a breaking heart, wanting to run out and protect her mother, but knowing that might worsen an already dangerous situation. Reggie remained standing there, clearly unsure what to do, his eyes darting from Owen to Stella and back. Harrison had stopped struggling against his restraints and watched the scene with intense focus, still trying to say something through the gag. Marcus was on the phone again, urging the authorities to hurry, explaining that the situation had become more volatile with the entry of another civilian. Owen began circling Stella like a predator, speaking with that hypnotic voice he used to manipulate and control. He said she should have stayed hidden in Asheville, that she should have accepted Harrison's money and kept quiet, that now she had put herself in an impossible position. Stella did not back down, did not show the fear Dana knew she must be feeling. Instead, she said something that surprised everyone in the warehouse, including Dana. She had recorded Owen threatening her all those years ago, had kept that recording as insurance for 2 decades, and now that recording was in the hands of the authorities along with all the other evidence of his frauds and crimes. Owen's face lost some of its confident arrogance as he processed that revelation. Reggie began to stammer something about how this changed everything, how they needed to leave immediately. But Owen violently gestured for him to shut up, his eyes fixed on Stella with a menacing intensity. He asked why, if she had that recording all this time. She had never used it before. Stella replied with painful honesty, because she was too afraid, because he had broken her so completely with his threats that even having a weapon against him, she couldn't find the courage to use it. But now, she said with a firm voice, everything is different. My daughter is involved, and there is nothing a mother won't do to protect her daughter. It was at that moment that Dana could no longer stay hidden. She pushed the side door completely open and entered the warehouse, walking until she stood beside her mother. Marcus tried to hold her back, but she pulled away, and now they stood there, mother and daughter side by side, together facing the man who had caused so much suffering in their lives. Owen looked at Dana, recognizing her from the descriptions Reggie must have given, and let out a humorless laugh. He said that this was touching, truly touching, such an emotional family reunion. But it didn't change the fundamental facts of the situation. He still had Harrison hostage. He still had resources and connections that they didn't. He still had ways to get out of this situation. Dana replied in a calm voice that he was wrong. The authorities were on their way, probably already surrounding the building. All the evidence of his crimes was documented and in the hands of people who could not be intimidated or bought. And most importantly, the cycle of fear he had used to control so many people for so many years was finally broken. He no longer had power over them. Owen started to respond, but was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens. The sound grew rapidly louder, multiple vehicles converging on the warehouse location. The expression on Owen's face changed, the mask of control finally slipping to reveal something closer to panic. Reggie ran toward the back door, trying to escape, but was confronted by police officers who had already surrounded the building. He was quickly immobilized, offering no resistance, crying and babbling about how he was just the accountant, how he didn't know things would go this far. Owen stood frozen in the center of the warehouse, watching his carefully constructed world crumble around him. He looked at Stella, at Dana, at Harrison tied to the chair, and for a moment Dana thought he might do something desperate and reckless. But then he simply raised his hands in surrender as the officers entered, that cold smile back on his face, as if he was still convinced he would find a way out of this situation too. Marcus rushed to Harrison and began untying him while the police arrested Owen and Reggie. Harrison was disoriented and clearly traumatized, but physically unharmed apart from a few bruises and dehydration. He looked at Dana and Stella with eyes shining with tears of relief and something that could be gratitude or shame, or both. A paramedic who had arrived with the police began examining Harrison, while another checked Stella and Dana to ensure they were okay. The scene had a chaotic and surreal quality, with officers moving in and out, evidence being catalogued, statements being collected. Albert arrived moments later, visibly relieved to see everyone was safe. He immediately assumed the role of attorney, ensuring everyone's rights were protected, that statements were properly given, that the chain of custody for the evidence was maintained intact. The district attorney arrived soon after, observing the scene with an expression of grim satisfaction. Cases like this, with such calculating and aggressive perpetrators finally being brought to justice, were not common, and he seemed determined to ensure that this time the charges were solid and comprehensive enough to guarantee significant convictions. As Owen and Reggie were led to police cars, Owen looked at Stella one last time. There was no regret in his eyes, Dana realized, only a cold rage at finally being defeated. Stella held his gaze steadily, without flinching, and Dana felt immense pride in her mother at that moment. The woman who had lived hidden for over 2 decades, paralyzed by fear, had finally found the courage to face her tormentor. And in doing so, she had not only freed herself, but also protected others from suffering the same fate at that man's hands. Harrison was taken to the hospital for observation, despite insisting he was fine. Dana and Stella went with him, refusing to leave him alone after what he had endured. At the hospital, while doctors examined him, Harrison finally had the chance to properly thank both of them for saving his life. He told Stella, with a choked voice, that he deeply regretted not having the courage to defend her when Owen first threatened her, that his cowardice had haunted him for decades. Stella, with a generosity that Dana could barely comprehend, said she forgave him, that she understood that fear could paralyze even the most well-intentioned people, that the important thing was that he had finally found the courage to do the right thing. The following hours were a blur of formal statements, conversations with investigators, and the slow process of beginning to process everything that had happened. Albert kept them informed about the legal proceedings. Owen and Reggie were being formally charged with multiple counts of fraud, forgery of documents, and now also kidnapping. The evidence was overwhelming, and Albert was confident that both would face substantial prison sentences. The recording Stella had kept for all those years, showing Owen explicitly threatening her and mentioning his frauds, was particularly devastating to his defense. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching us from. Returning to the story. 3 months had passed since that tense day in the abandoned warehouse in the Charleston Industrial Park. Autumn was already beginning to show signs of its arrival, bringing cooler afternoons and a deeper blue sky over the city's historic colonial buildings. Dana was sitting on the porch of the house Stella had rented in downtown Charleston, watching the quiet movement of the street as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the cobblestone pavement. Her mother had made the decision to leave Asheville permanently, to stop living as Elaine Rhodes and reclaim her true identity, rebuilding her life in the place she had been forced to flee so many years ago. The house was small but welcoming, with wide windows that let in plenty of light and a backyard where Stella had started planting aromatic herbs and flowers. The prosecution against Owen Barrett and Reggie Travis advanced methodically through the judicial system. Albert kept Dana, Stella, and Harrison constantly informed about every development. The charges were extensive and devastating: financial fraud spanning multiple decades and companies, forgery of official documents, blackmail, witness intimidation, and kidnapping. Owen's defense initially attempted to question the validity of such old evidence, argue about the statute of limitations, negotiate plea deals. But the recordings Stella had kept for 23 years, combined with the recent emails found on Reggie's flash drive and Harrison's kidnapping, created an unbreakable legal narrative. The prosecutor had built a case so solid that even Owen's expensive lawyers seemed resigned to trying only to minimize the damage rather than avoid it completely. Reggie, as expected, had turned against Owen almost immediately after the arrest. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided detailed testimony about all the fraudulent operations they had conducted together over the years, including schemes in other cities and companies that investigators didn't even know existed. His testimony opened new lines of investigation, revealing a network of corruption much broader than anyone had initially imagined. Other victims began to surface, encouraged by the news of Owen's arrest. People he had intimidated into silence in New York, Atlanta, even in smaller towns across the country. Myrtle, the woman who had initially sought out Stella, came to Charleston to testify, and her story painfully echoed Stella's, a repeated pattern of manipulation and abuse of power. Harrison had undergone significant transformations in the months following the kidnapping. The experience of being tied up in that warehouse, listening to Owen and Reggie discuss his fate, facing the real possibility of fatal consequences for his past choices, had changed something fundamental in him. He began regular therapy, confronting not only the recent trauma, but also decades of repressed guilt and patterns of cowardly behavior that had defined crucial moments of his life. He sold the factory to a group of ethical investors who guaranteed to keep all the jobs, using a substantial portion of the sale money to create a reparations fund for Owen's victims, including a significant amount for Stella in recognition of the years stolen from her. Stella, in turn, had used that money not for luxuries or indulgences, but for practical purposes that reflected who she truly was. She bought the small house where she now lived, invested in continuing education in accounting to update her skills after years out of the formal market, and donated a generous portion to the Artisans Cooperative in Asheville that had given her employment and dignity when she needed it most. She also began working as a volunteer financial consultant for small businesses in Charleston, using her experience to help local entrepreneurs keep their books in order, finding purpose and satisfaction in using her skills for something genuinely good. The relationship between Dana and Stella had deepened and matured with time and proximity. Living in the same city for the first time in over 2 decades, they spent time together regularly, rebuilding the lost years, not through lamenting the past, but by creating new memories in the present. They cooked together, walked through the Charleston squares in the cool afternoons, visited the scenic parks on weekends, talking about everything and nothing. There were moments when the pain of those separated years still surfaced, usually late at night when defenses were down, but they had learned to navigate that pain together, sharing the weight instead of carrying it alone. Dana had found her own path as well. She decided not to return to work as a cook, at least not in the way she had before. Instead, with some initial capital borrowed from Harrison that she meticulously planned to repay, she opened a small cafe in downtown Charleston. The place was cozy and modest, with only 8 tables, but it served exceptional coffee and homemade cakes that she prepared herself using recipes from the grandmother who had raised her. The cafe quickly became popular among locals, a place where people came not just for the food, but for the welcoming atmosphere Dana had created. Stella often helped out in the mornings, managing the register while Dana worked in the kitchen, and there was something deeply satisfying in that shared routine. Harrison visited the cafe regularly, always sitting at the same table near the window, where he read newspapers and watched the street movement. His relationship with Dana and Stella had evolved into something complex and unexpected, not exactly friendship in the traditional sense, but a connection forged through shared suffering and collective redemption. He never tried to minimize his guilt or apologize excessively, understanding that some things could not be completely forgiven, only accepted and overcome. But he showed up consistently, offering silent support through his presence, and gradually that presence became part of the new normal they were all building. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, almost 4 months after the kidnapping, that Albert called with the news everyone had been waiting for. Owen Barrett's trial had concluded and the jury had returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentencing would be announced the following week, but Albert was confident that Owen would face at least 15 years in prison, possibly more, depending on how the judge considered the multiple aggravating factors. Reggie, for cooperating extensively, received a lesser sentence of 6 years, but still substantial enough to represent real consequences for his actions. Dana hung up the phone and looked at her mother, who was wiping down a table after the last customer of the afternoon had left. The two looked at each other in silence for a long moment, and then Stella began to cry. They weren't tears of sadness, Dana realized, but of relief so profound it needed to be physically released. 23 years carrying the weight of that fear, 23 years looking over her shoulder, and now, finally, definitively, it was over. Owen Barrett would spend the next years behind bars, incapable of threatening or intimidating anyone. The other victims he had silenced over the decades finally had justice, and Stella could, for the first time since she fled Charleston all those years ago, breathe completely free. Dana hugged her mother, letting her own tears flow, and they stood that way for long minutes in the empty cafe, holding on to each other as decades of tension finally dissolved. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold Thursday morning at the Charleston courthouse. Dana, Stella, and Harrison were all present, sitting in the hard seats of the public gallery, watching as the legal process took its methodical course. Owen sat at the defense table, his expensive clothes replaced by the orange prison jumpsuit, his posture still upright but lacking the arrogance he had always carried. He did not look back even once during the entire proceeding, keeping his eyes fixed forward as the judge read the sentence. 22 years in federal prison for financial fraud, forgery of documents, blackmail, witness intimidation, and kidnapping, with the possibility of parole only after serving at least 15 years. 22 years. Owen was 62 now, which meant he would be nearly 80 when he was eligible for parole, if he survived that long. It was effectively a life sentence, Dana recognized, and she felt a grim but real satisfaction seeing justice finally served. She looked at her mother and saw a similar expression on Stella's face, not exactly joy, but a sense of closure, of circles finally being completed. When the judge banged the gavel and Owen was led out of the courtroom by guards, Stella held Dana's hand and whispered softly that it was finally over, that they could move on now without that shadow hanging over them. It was on a sunny late autumn Saturday that the last and most significant twist occurred, though this time it was positive and hopeful rather than traumatic. Dana was at the cafe, preparing to close after a particularly busy day, when Stella arrived with a strange look on her face, something between apprehension and excitement. She said she had received a call from Myrtle, the woman from New York who had been one of Owen's other victims. Myrtle was organizing a support group for all the people who had suffered at Owen's hands over the years, a way to share experiences, process trauma collectively, and turn their individual stories of victimization into a collective narrative of survival and resilience. Stella said Myrtle had invited her to help co-found the group, to use her unique experience as someone who had lived hidden for decades but had finally found the courage to confront her tormentor. It was an opportunity to transform all that suffering into something meaningful, to help other people who were where she had been, paralyzed by fear and shame. Dana could see the light in her mother's eyes as she spoke about it, a sense of purpose that went beyond simply rebuilding her own life. She enthusiastically encouraged Stella, saying it would be incredible that her mother had so much to offer to others in similar situations. The support group began its monthly meetings in Charleston, using a room provided free of charge by the city council. Initially, there were only 6 people, including Stella and Myrtle, but word spread, and within a few months, the group had grown to nearly 20 regular members. They were men and women of all ages, from different cities and backgrounds, all united by the shared experience of having been manipulated, intimidated, or harmed by Owen Barrett throughout his extensive criminal career. The stories that emerged in those meetings were simultaneously devastating and inspiring, testaments to human resilience in the face of terrible circumstances. Dana often observed the support group meetings from the periphery, never officially participating, but always available if her mother needed her. She saw the transformation in Stella, how her mother gradually became more confident, more assertive, rediscovering parts of herself that had been suppressed by years of living in hiding. There was a lightness about Stella now that simply hadn't existed before, a freedom in the way she laughed, the way she moved through the world without constantly looking over her shoulder. Seeing that transformation was more rewarding for Dana than any court sentence could have been, because it represented not just punishment for the perpetrator, but genuine healing for the victims. On a Friday night, 6 months after the trial, Dana closed the cafe and went for a walk alone through the streets of Charleston. She passed the main square where she had sat that anxious morning so many months ago, past Harrison's mansion where everything had begun that fateful afternoon when he came home early, past the narrow streets of the historic downtown she now knew so well. There was a sense of completeness, of closed circles and new ones beginning. The revenge she had sought so intensely in the beginning had transformed into something more complex and satisfying. Not just punishment, but restoration. Not just exposure, but healing. She thought of her grandmother, who had raised her after Stella's disappearance, carrying her own secrets and sorrows until the end. She thought of all the years she and her mother had lost, time that could never be recovered. But she also thought of everything they had gained, a relationship rebuilt on more honest and stronger foundations, a community of survivors supporting one another, the satisfaction of knowing that other people would be protected because they had found the courage to speak up. It didn't erase the pain of the lost years, but it gave purpose and meaning to that suffering, transforming it into something beyond mere personal tragedy. When Dana returned home that night, she found Stella in the kitchen, brewing tea as she did on cooler evenings. They sat together at the small table, holding warm mugs in their hands, talking about small, everyday things, about plans for the cafe, about the next support group meeting. They didn't talk about Owen, about the past, about everything they had lost. Instead, they focused on the present, on the future they were building together, one conversation at a time, one day at a time. And in that, Dana realized, lay the true victory. Not in Owen's imprisonment, though that was important, but in the reconstruction of their own lives, in such a way that he no longer held any power over them. Months turned into a full year since that afternoon when Harrison had come home early and found Dana in his study. The 1-year anniversary of that day passed almost unnoticed, marked only by a quiet dinner that Dana, Stella, and Harrison shared at the cafe after closing. They toasted, not to the anniversary of that difficult day, but to the year of rebuilding that had followed, to the connections forged through adversity, to the courage each of them had found in critical moments. Harrison thanked both of them for saving not only his physical life in that warehouse, but also his moral life, by forcing him to finally confront his own failures and make amends. Stella shared that she had been contacted by a national organization working with victims of financial fraud and corporate abuse, asking her to become a regional spokesperson and help expand the support group's work to other cities. It was a daunting but exciting opportunity, a chance to broaden the impact of the work she and Myrtle had started. Dana encouraged her mother to accept, offering to adjust the cafe hours to accommodate the additional responsibilities Stella would take on. There was evident pride in Dana's voice as she spoke about her mother's work, proud to see the woman who had been forced into silence for so long now, using her voice to help others. Dana's cafe had become more than just a business for her. It was a community space, a place where people met, talked, and shared their lives. She knew most of her regular customers by name, knew their favorite orders, and asked about their families. There was something deeply satisfying in that, in creating a space that contributed positively to the social fabric of Charleston, so different from the manipulation and extraction that had characterized Owen's businesses. Dana was building something based on genuine value, on real connections, and that mattered in ways money could never measure. On a particularly beautiful spring afternoon, almost 18 months after the events that had changed all their lives, Dana was tidying up the cafe when a young woman walked in, looking nervous and hesitant. She approached the counter and asked if Dana was the Dana Miller who had helped expose Owen Barrett. When Dana confirmed, the woman began to cry, explaining that her father had been one of Owen's victims years ago, that the frauds had destroyed their small family business, but they had never had the courage to report it for fear of retaliation. Now, seeing Owen finally in prison, her family finally had peace, finally could move forward, knowing that justice had been done. Dana hugged the woman, letting her cry on her shoulder, deeply understanding that relief and gratitude. It was moments like that which made everything worthwhile, which reminded Dana that the suffering she and her mother had endured was not in vain. Every victim of Owen who could now breathe easier, every destroyed family that could begin to rebuild, every person who found the courage to report other abuses because they had seen that it was possible to confront powerful perpetrators and win, all of that was part of the positive legacy that had emerged from so much pain. Stella developed the habit of writing, not unsent letters as she had done for so many years, but a blog where she shared her experiences and reflections on trauma, recovery, and justice. Her posts were honest and moving, avoiding both self-pity and exaggerated heroism, simply telling her story with the clarity that came from finally processing it completely. The blog gained a modest but dedicated following, people who saw themselves in Stella's words, who found comfort and inspiration in her journey. Some readers eventually joined the support group, others just read and moved forward with their own lives, a little less alone than before. Harrison used his time and resources to work with Albert on creating a foundation focused on helping small business owners implement proper financial controls and identify signs of fraud early. It was his way of making broader amends, of using his experience both as a victim and as someone who had failed to act against fraud when he had the chance. The foundation offered free workshops, subsidized consulting, and educational resources, all aimed at preventing others from going through what he and so many of Owen's victims had endured. It didn't erase his past mistakes, but it created something positive in the present that could impact the future. 2 years after that fateful afternoon, Dana was at the cafe on a quiet Tuesday morning when she received a call from Albert. He had news. Owen had requested early parole, but the request had been denied decisively. The parole board had extensively reviewed his case, including statements from multiple victims, and concluded that Owen showed no genuine remorse, nor had he made any real effort toward rehabilitation. He would serve his full sentence, no shortcuts, no last-minute manipulations. It was a final reminder that this time, finally, he couldn't simply walk away from his actions through charm, connections, or intimidation. Dana thanked Albert for the update and hung up, looking around her cafe where a few regular customers were having breakfast, reading newspapers, and talking softly. There was normalcy there, a normalcy she and her mother had fought so hard to achieve. It wasn't a perfect life. There were still difficult days, moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly, scars that would never completely heal. But it was a life of their own, built on their own terms, free from the fear that had defined so many years. And in that, Dana realized, lay the true triumph, not in the absence of pain, but in the ability to build something beautiful despite it, to transform trauma into purpose, suffering into connection, and fear into courage. That evening, Dana closed the cafe and walked to Stella's house. Her mother was in the backyard garden, tending to the plants that had grown robust and healthy under her careful watch. They sat together on the small wooden bench that Harrison had built and donated as a birthday gift to Stella, watching the sun set over the Charleston rooftops, staining the sky with vibrant oranges and pinks. They didn't need to speak much. The company of one another was enough, two women who had traversed decades of separation and suffering to finally find not only each other, but also themselves. The story of Dana and Stella did not have a perfectly happy ending in the fairy tale sense, where all problems were magically solved and everyone lived happily ever after. But it had something perhaps more valuable, a true ending, where wounds were acknowledged and gradually healed, where mistakes were confronted and amends were made as much as possible, where justice was served and victims regained their voices. It was an ending that honored the complexity of the human experience, the real cost of trauma and recovery, the courage needed to keep building a good life even after it had been brutally interrupted. And as the sun set over Charleston that spring evening, Dana Miller and Stella Fields sat together in a garden cultivated with love and patience. Two survivors who had finally found peace, not through revenge or forgetting, but through the slow, difficult journey of confronting the past, demanding justice, and building a future where they could finally, genuinely, breathe free. Dana's cafe would continue serving the community. Stella's support group would continue helping other victims. Harrison's foundation would continue educating business owners, and the lives that Owen Barrett had tried to destroy would carry on, resilient and determined, proving that even the darkest shadows eventually give way to light when one has enough courage to keep walking toward the dawn.